Is Jesus really God? What does the Bible say about that? That's what we're going to look at today as we examine a particular passage in John 1 and 1, a very familiar passage. And what we're going to see through our examination is, does this particular verse truly state that Jesus is God? Okay, so let's look at it. Let's start here in the English. Very familiar. As a matter of fact, you can probably quote it from memorization. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, as you know, and as it is in the habit of all of our teachings, we always want to refer to the original text for examination of a particular passage, especially when we want to look at it in a close way. All right. So we're going to move on over to John. And it's interesting that we are looking at this particular concept from the book of John. Okay. As a matter of fact, let me take a minute. Sometimes you may have wondered if we're only talking about one person, that is Jesus, and the gospel or the good news is basically a biography of his life or his person or his works, then what is the purpose that we have four gospels? If we just got one Jesus, the Messiah, Christos, then why four gospels? And the beauty of that basically is from the idea of perspective. Have you ever watched television and you saw somebody being arrested or put in jail or whatever? You know, when they go through the fingerprinting process, and what they do is when they take pictures, they have the person turn to the right, turn to the left, turn to the right, so that you can get a good picture, a full, you can be able to identify completely that individual from whatever way they may turn or whatever, full picture. And basically that's what we have in the Gospels. That's the reason for the four Gospels in the first place, is so that we can get a full picture from the different perspectives about the person of Jesus. For example, and we'll just simply say this in a roundabout way, the Gospel of Matthew. Why did he write it? Matthew was unto the Jews. It's very Jewish. It's saying to the Jewish people that this Jesus is son of Abraham. He's also the son of David. He is the promised Messiah to the Jewish people. Mark wants to, in his gospel, he shows the servant side of Jesus. And then from the Luke perspective, as he clearly says, Luke says, he basically gave a documentary. So when you want to look at the life of Jesus in basic chronological order and how the events happen, Luke says that's basically what he did. And he researched this material in order to give a historical account for Jesus's life. And then finally, the Gospel of John. Now, John gives a very unique perspective of Jesus. Not only is he Matthew, the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah of God, not only is he Mark, the servant one, the servant of God. You also see that particular concept in Isaiah chapter 40, the servant of God. And Luke, not only does John tells us historically some of the events in Jesus' life, but he also gives us an invaluable concept concerning the person of Jesus. And it begins in John 1 and 1. And that's why John's gospel is so unique as he begins to talk about the person of Jesus. He speaks from his eternal personhood. All right. Now that we got that out of the way, we always tell you how that the scriptures, Old Testament was given in Hebrew, our New Testament was given in Greek. And there are certain things that we can see in the original text that sometimes may not be quite evident in our translation, or sometimes you can bring out greater emphasis when we look at the original language. So now we're going to go to the original language of our New Testament, and that is in Greek. And we're going to look at John 1 and 1. Again, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And we're going to look at that as it's originally written, and we're going to see exactly what is it that John was trying to say concerning the person of Jesus. Now notice verse number 1, and he begins, NRK, in beginning. Now what's interesting about this is this. Now in our English it says in the beginning. But in our Greek text, it says NRK, which literally translates in beginning. There is what we call the absence of a definite article. Definite article simply means the word the. The. That's what the is. All right. And so whenever you see the or the definite article being used in the Greek, also functions pretty much the same way in Hebrew, it is pointing to something specific, a particular or specific point. But notice here, as it says NRK, RK is that Greek word for beginning. There is no definite article. So John is not saying in the beginning, pointing to a particular moment in time. John says in beginning. So the concept that John is trying to bring about is the dateless past. He's not trying to point to a particular time in the past. He's just simply saying the dateless past. And it gets really clear here that what John is referring to is the same concept that we see in the book of Genesis. Notice in Genesis 1 and 1, and we're not going to deal with that right now, but very quickly, what it says is, Barashit bara Elohim. And that is, in beginning, God created. Once again, in the Hebrew, the definite article is not present, Barashit. Okay. So it would literally translate in beginning. That is the idea of the dateless past, sometime in the past, at no particular point, eternity past. And that's the concept. Now let's go back over to our John. So in eternity past, what? Was the Word. So the first thing that John lets us know about this particular the person of Jesus, and we know that's what we're developing, the idea of the person of Jesus, is that he existed in eternity past. There was no point of coming into being. There was no point or time in which he himself did not exist. He always existed. NRK Logos. The Logos always existed for all eternity in the past. Okay, and now something else too. And notice his reference, and we're not going to make a big deal out of this, but he says, in the beginning was Halagos, the Word. And sometimes you may read a bunch of different commentaries, and they all try to bring about this issue of how John is relating to some form of Greek philosophy as he tries to relate to Jesus. And they going through all of this talking in Greek philosophy, which that's not what John is doing at all. Okay. What John is simply doing is this. First, you have to understand who John was. John was basically a Jewish fisherman. He was a Jewish fisherman, right? Brought up in first century Jewish culture. And basically, he would learn of his religious ideas and thoughts from whom? Jewish rabbis. So to understand Logos, we don't understand it from the Greek Philo and all of these people. That's not the whole issue. The issue is John, as he writes his gospel, would be a Jewish man taught from first century Jewish theologians. And so therefore you would want to know, what would the first century Jewish rabbis teach? What would be the thought concept concerning this? And now where we're aiming simply is this: we're trying to demystify this whole concept of logos, so that you'll feel more comfortable with it. All right. And so what is he doing? So let's go back to rabbinical thought. What did the rabbis teach, and why did John use this particular word logos? Right now, you have to go all the way back onto the Hebrew idea or concept of logos. And basically that comes from the Hebrew word davar. Davar. And you'll see that pretty much, say for instance, if we had to make a quick shoot to Genesis 15 and 1. 15 and 1. All right. And we don't want to get into this particular passage, but what it does is it allows us to see the early forms of development from which we get later on in our discussion today the word logos. Notice, and it says, and I'm reading from the Hebrew, after achar davarim, after these things, what? And here's our key: Hayah davar Yahweh. The word of the Lord became, or the word of the Lord. But here's the thing that we want to highlight: davar Yahweh, the word of the Lord. The word of the Lord did what? It became, and we basically translated it came to Avram, came to Abraham in the vision. So notice it says that the word of God came to him. All right. And that's the concept from which we are developing logos. So logos comes from the Hebrew concept. And notice these, because it's Jewish, it's a Jewish cultural framework that we have to deal with these things. The word davar, right? Now, later on, we know that, and we don't have time to go through all of the history, this concept further developed into what was known as the memra. Once that, so much history and so little time. We know that the Jewish people, through judgment from God, were sent into Babylon. And that's when they began to undergo a dramatic structure in how they would write the scriptures. Okay. And so no longer in the Akkadian script of Hebrew, but now we see the Aramaic script. And isn't that confusing? I may be telling you things you have, but bear with me. So what happens is, now you move into the Aramaic, okay? And that's the key. And so dealing with the same concept of davar, that is the word, it now translates Aramaic into the memra. Memra. So now you go from davar, the word, to memra in Aramaic, right? And now the rabbis taught, and here is where we are today. The rabbis taught certain things about the memra. And this was the concept to which John, the writer of John's gospel, would be exposed to. He would be exposed to these particular concepts concerning davar, the memra, concerning this. What is this concept? The rabbis taught that the memra was distinct from God, and sometimes the rabbis would say the memra was the same as God, the word. So the distinction, and also then they sometimes say it's the same as God. And then again, the rabbis taught that the memra was an agent of salvation. You remember when God led them through the Red Sea and delivered them with a great and mighty outstretched hand. He did this. He saved them by his memra, davar, his word. By his word, he saved them. And also the rabbis saw the memra as an agent of salvation. right? And a final point, and it can go on and on and on. But let's bring out a final point because it will have relevance to the context of this passage today. The rabbis also said that the memra was the means by which God would become visible. God would become visible by the memra. Okay, now let's go back to our text. Let's go back to our text. The word. So why did John choose this term halagos? Because very simply, the target language of interpretation. What is John doing? He's trying to bring these Jewish concepts and Jewish thought into the target language of the day, which is Greek. And so therefore you go from what? The very beginning, Davar, Hebrew, then of course, Memra, which is Aramaic, and now the target language. So what would be the target language for Memra? Logos. Logos. So he's not dealing with any type of Greek concept of this and that whatsoever. It's all about bringing in the Hebrew idea of the Devar, the Memra, into a Greek word, the target language. And so he uses logos. You got it? That rabbinical thought into a target language in one word, logos. And so John says, and this logos, this memra, this devar, this thing that we once considered, that we once thought about, and that our rabbinical teachers thought about, he existed in the beginning with God. It was in the beginning. I'm sorry, I'm a little ahead of myself. It was in the beginning. He had what? No coming into existence. He simply, like God, always existed. NRK ein halagos. In the beginning was the word. And now let's move to our second phrase. And kahalagos ein proston theon. And the word was with God. And now let's talk about that. Here's what we want to talk about. Proston theon. Okay. And the word was, and we basically translate that with God. Now, there are a couple of things we want to bring out. So allow me to take my time and explain it to you. Proston theon was with God. The idea of this Greek construction is to show not only proximity, that is, the word was dwelling alongside of God, all right, but also in its construction is used to relate a sense of intimacy or a sense of fellowship. And as later on, as what we'll see, and we'll see this being developed all throughout the Gospel of John, the unity of the Word, or as we know later on, Jesus, the unity of the Son with the Father, of the Son with God Himself. So he uses early on that construction, pros ton theon. The Word was in a fellowship, dwelling alongside of God. You got it? Okay, and let's move on to the final section. And katheos ein halagos. And, but now here's the direct translation. And God was the Word. And God was the Word. Now notice here. All right, we got to get into a little grammar. And if you're like most people, you hate that part, but sometimes it's just the most important part of all. He says, and God was the Word. Notice what he did not say. He did not say that the word halagos is the same as God. That is the Unitarian concept. The Unitarian concept. He did not say, okay, I'm going to calm it down. and explain it. Theos. Notice here that theos does not have the definite article attached to it. Right, just step back just a little bit. Tom theon. All right. That is the Greek word for God. But there is a definite article. And oftentimes you will see that with the word God. You'll see the definite article. And so we just simply we don't translate it the God. We translate it simply as God, right? But what we understand is there is grammatical meaning when there is a definite article and there is a grammatical meaning or suggestion in the absence when there is no definite article. So now let's go back to our text and see what's going on. And God, there is here no definite article. The reason is because he is not referring to God. That's the issue here. He's not referring to God, but in the absence of God, he is referring or attributing the nature of God. In other words, whatever makes God God, you got it? That's what it means by the nature of God. Whatever makes God God, notice, ein halagos was the word. So whatever it is that makes God God, the word has the same thing. The word is, now what he did not say was this. Now here's what you got to watch carefully. He did not say definite article ha theos ain't halagos. If he had said ha theos and the God was the word, he would have said this. And the God that I was talking about when I said that was with God, that's the same thing as the word. He didn't say that. So he is clearly continuing to distinguish the difference between God and the Word. So we have two persons that John is highlighting for us. We have the person of God and we have the person of the Word. But what John is trying to tell us is the nature of God is the same shared nature of the word. So that what we can say is that as God is fully God, the word is fully God. Okay? And for a little more context, let's move to verse number 2. He says, hutos, and I love that. He's for a brief moment he stops using the term the word and just begins to use a pointer. He uses a relative pronoun. This one. It uses a relative pronoun like a pointer, pointing back to what? Pointing back to the logos. The logos. Notice once again he emphasizes the point. Hutas ain't. This one was in beginning with, notice, was in beginning pros ton theon, with God. Again, that concept that he is developing. This one was in the beginning. What? And notice again, ein arche, there is no definite article there, or in beginning, in eternity past. What? This one in eternity past. Pros ton theon, with God. The idea, again, 2 points. One who is in fellowship, in close relationship with God. But notice again, he says, ton theon, the God. The reason he uses the definite article again is to separate in the idea of persons. The Logos is not the God that I'm talking about, but he is with God. All right. So what do we learn? We learn 3 things that Jesus, and right now we haven't identified this particular Logos, but we know since this is the Gospel of John, that's who we're talking about. We learn 3 things: that Jesus eternally existed with God the Father. He had no time that he was created. He did not come into being. He just always was, just like God always was. Number one. Number two, we learn that, notice, proston theon. He was in close relationship with the Father. And again, that's when we bring about, and we see this in the book of John, always. Remember, Jesus would say some things like, I and the Father are one. He's not declaring or saying that he is the Father. He is just the development of this particular idea, this particular theme that John brings out in the very first verse, that unity, that inseparable unity of Father and Son. All right. And the third thing that we see in this verse, then notice what it says, and God was the Word, right? That construction says that he had the very nature of God. All that God is, Logos, the Word is, that is, Jesus is, or in, as we would simply say it, he is fully 100% completely God. And that's the point that John makes in John 1. And let's just go to John 1 and 14. Let's cap it off with that. And what does he say? And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we saw his glory. Glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. All right, let's move on over to our Greek text. What does he say? And the word flesh. And notice, it almost seems to put it in an emphatic sense. And when I say emphatic sense, okay. In Greek, word order is not the same as in English. Again, and that's what we call our target language when we translate target language. Okay. Sometimes in Greek, the word order is given to highlight the emphasis of something, or kind of like to draw your attention to something. And so in verse 14, notice what John seems to be implying is he's highlighting a remarkable thing about the Logos, a remarkable thing about God. What? And halaga sarx, the Word became flesh. God himself became a man. And that is the most remarkable concept in Scripture, that God would become fully a human being and live with us. Okay. And halaga sas egenata, the Word became flesh, and notice, and eskenosane. Let me make sure I pronounce it right. Eskenosane, that's correct. Eskenosane. Now, this word here comes from the Greek word skenao, which literally means to dwell or inhabit. And the beautiful thing about this word is this is Hebrew derivative. All right. And you're probably familiar with it. Are you familiar with the term Shekinah? Or sometimes I hear people say Shekinah. But the idea that we find this particular concept in the Old Testament. Remember when Moses in Exodus 24 through 40, chapters 24 through 40, when he set up the tabernacle and the glory of God indwelled the innermost part of the holy place, the most holy place, the innermost part of the tabernacle, and this great light that filled the tabernacle structure, the light that shone so great that nobody could even stand. The priest could not even stand and minister in the tabernacle, or in a similar way in which the visible glory of God came into the house, the temple that Solomon built, the Shekinah, the glory of God. Now, in Greek, they don't have the sh sound, so they use the sk sound. And so that's when we get the idea of skenao. So what John is doing is he is relating what? He is relating the tabernacle dwelling. He is relating the tabernacle presence. He's relating the glory of God in that visible glory of God in the tabernacle as he uses the word concerning Jesus in his physical human presence with the disciples. Notice, and the word flesh became, and here is the direct translation. The word became flesh and tabernacled among us. That's literally what he said. So we can see John's relating Jesus's living and dwelling here in the same sense of God's presence among the Israelites. How? By virtue of the tabernacle. As God dwelled with them, how did God dwell with them? In the tabernacle, and we see what? All of the tribes of Israel surrounding the tabernacle, God dwelling among them. We see the same thing with Jesus, but no longer in a tabernacle structure, but in a body of flesh. And that body of flesh tabernacled, dwelled among us. That glory of God himself, right? And then notice what John said, and we, ite samita, my pronunciation is awful. But the whole point what John said here is this. Now listen, he uses the Greek word that means not just simply to look at, right? He says, but this word literally means to look at intently. That is almost in the sense of to study. We looked at him really deeply. And what did we see? We saw his glory. We saw the doxana too. We saw the glory of him, right? What glory? The glory of the, and we're not going to get into monogonous. We're not going to even deal with that right now. And that's the Greek word which we translate only begotten, the only begotten patros, only begotten from the Father. Okay. And we're not going to get into that. But the key thing that we want to bring about in this particular verse is this. When we combine verse 1, that is, in eternity past existed for all times, what? The Davar, the Memra, Halagos, the Word in eternity past. And this Word was in unity, wonderful relationship with God the Father. And you know what was wonderful and remarkable about this Word? Everything that God is, so is the Word, and the Word is God. And then we get to verse 14, and he says, and the most remarkable thing took place through Miriam, that is Mary, a virgin. The Word became flesh. And that's what Mary provided. She provided a flesh suit, a body in that sense. The Word became flesh. And what did he do? As the glory of the tabernacle was among the tribes of Israel in their wilderness wandering, so was the glory of God dwelling among us. And you know what we did? We looked at him intently. We examined him intently. And to see, what did we see? We found, or I'm sorry, what did we see? We saw his glory. It was a glory full of grace and full of truth. Now, what does John say to us? John says that Jesus was completely and fully God. All right. Thanks for joining me. And by the way, you know, this is a new YouTube channel. So if you have not subscribed, subscribe. And if you like the video, like. And if you would, leave a comment. Give me your suggestions. Tell me what you think. Or just say, hey, Eric, I enjoyed the video. All right, guys. Till next time.